The air smells like wet clay and smoke. Not the clean smoke of a campfire in open land, but the dense, layered smoke of 10,000 fires burning at once. Bread ovens, kilns, torches, funeral pyres, the smelting of copper, the burning of refuse at the edge of a canal. The sound is something you cannot prepare for. There is no silence here. There never was. There are children arguing in a language that will not survive. There are oxen being pushed through narrow alleys. There is the rhythmic thud of stone pestles grinding grain before dawn. Because grain must be ground, because bread must be made, because thousands of mouths wake up hungry every single morning and someone has to feed them. There is a man on a rooftop staring south toward the river, watching the sky go pale at the horizon. He is not doing anything remarkable. He is simply standing in the oldest city that has ever existed. And he has no idea. That is the thing about Uruk. Nobody who lived there called it the first city. Nobody kept a record that said, "This is where it begins." They did not know they were the beginning. They just knew the walls, the temple, the smell of the canal in summer, when the water dropped low and the reeds went yellow. They knew the sound of the marketplace before the sun was fully up. They knew the weight of a clay tablet in the hand, the pressure of a reed stylus pressed at an angle. They knew, in the way that people always know the texture of their own ordinary life, that this place was enormous, that it was complicated, and that it had always been this way. Except it had not. Nothing like this had ever existed before. And the fact that it did, that it rose, that it lasted, that it fell, and that we still do not fully understand why, is one of the most extraordinary stories the human race has ever lived through without realizing it. To understand what Uruk was, you have to understand what the world looked like before it. And the honest answer is quieter, much, much quieter. The land between the two great rivers, the Tigris and the Euphrates in what is now southern Iraq, was not an empty desert. It was a floodplain. Flat, immense, crossed by channels of brown water that moved slowly under a white sky. The soil was extraordinarily fertile. Every year the rivers flooded, retreated, and left behind a thin, dark layer of silt that could grow almost anything. Barley, wheat, lentils, dates in long clusters hanging from palms that lined the canals. For thousands of years, people had lived here in small clusters. Farming villages, mostly. A few dozen families, 100 people at most. They shared labor during the harvest. They buried their dead under the floors of their homes, keeping them close in the way that people who live close to the land tend to keep everything close. They traded with neighboring settlements, obsidian from the mountains to the north, shells from the Persian Gulf to the south, copper ore that traveled remarkable distances across a landscape where almost no one traveled far. These were not primitive people. They had art. They had ritual. They had a deep understanding of the seasons and the behavior of the river. But they were spread thin across the land. And no single settlement had ever grown beyond a certain size because beyond a certain size, things start to fall apart. Uruk changed that equation. And the story of how it changed it is the story of one of the most consequential experiments in the entire history of our species. It began, as so many things begin, with water. The region around Uruk and sitting along a major channel of the Euphrates, roughly in the center of the southern floodplain, was particularly well suited to a specific kind of farming that would transform everything, large-scale irrigation. Not the simple diversion of water onto a nearby field, which farmers had been doing for millennia, but the engineering of an entire landscape. The cutting of long canals, the building of levees to control flooding, the coordinated management of water across an area large enough to feed not dozens but thousands of people. This required something that farming villages had never needed before: organization above the level of the family or the clan. Someone had to decide when to open the sluices. Someone had to coordinate labor for canal maintenance. Someone had to keep track of who contributed how much work and who received how much water in return. And here, in that quiet administrative necessity, something new was born. Not a king, not yet, but a system. A way of managing complexity. a structure that could hold more people together than personal loyalty alone ever could. By around 4000 BCE, Uruk was already the largest settlement in the world. That is not a small claim. By 3500 BCE, it may have held 30,000 people within its walls. By 3000 BCE, possibly 80,000. These are numbers that strain credulity, and because nothing like them had existed anywhere on Earth before. Rome at its height would not reach 1 million people until 2,000 years later. Uruk was not Rome, but in its time, relative to everything else that existed, it was a degree of concentration of human life that had no precedent. It was a rupture in the pattern. And in that rupture, everything we recognize as civilization began to take shape. Walk through Uruk in its prime, and you are walking through a city that has already invented most of the features of urban life that we still use today. The streets are not random. They follow the logic of the canal system, which follows the logic of the terrain. There are neighborhoods, not legally defined but recognizable by what happens in them. Here, the workshops of the potters, where a new technique has just changed everything. The fast wheel, which allows a single artisan to produce in 1 hour what used to take a day. There, the district of the textile workers, where wool is being spun and woven on a scale that requires not individual skill, but coordinated production. Thousands of women, enslaved or semi-enslaved, the records are not always kind about the distinctions, sit in long rows working fiber into cloth. The cloth will be exported. It will travel in boats down the canals, across the marshes, out into the Gulf, and northward along overland routes to settlements hundreds of kilometers away. Because Uruk is not just a city, it is an engine, a machine for transforming raw material into surplus, and surplus into power. At the center of the city stands the Inanna precinct, the great temple complex dedicated to Inanna, goddess of love and war, desire and destruction, and the most important deity in the Sumerian pantheon. The Inanna is not a single building. It is a district unto itself, a compound of monumental structures built on a raised platform of mud brick, their white plastered walls visible from a great distance across the flat landscape. The largest of the temples, which archaeologists would later call the White Temple, stands on a ziggurat, a stepped artificial mountain built from millions of mud brick units, hauled up by human hands and human backs over the course of generations. It is not the tallest structure ever built. It is not the most geometrically perfect. But in its landscape, flat, wide, featureless for miles in every direction, it is overwhelming. It says in the visual language of architecture, here's the center. Here is where the world is organized, and the organization happening inside that temple complex is genuinely revolutionary. Because the temple is not only a place of worship, it is a redistribution center, a storage facility, a labor manager, a proto-bank. The priests and administrators of the Inanna receive grain, wool, fish, oil, and livestock from the surrounding agricultural landscape. They record these inputs on clay tablets. They store the surplus. They redistribute it to the workers, the craftspeople, the canal laborers, the soldiers, the scribes, the specialists of every kind who cannot grow their own food because they are too busy doing everything else. The temple feeds the city, and the city feeds the temple. And the whole system turns on itself in a loop of organized complexity that has never existed anywhere before. And then, so quietly that no one seems to have made much fuss about it at the time, someone pressed a reed into wet clay and made a mark that meant something specific. A number, a quantity, a record, writing. The oldest writing in the world was born here in Uruk, sometime around 3300 BCE. And it was not born to tell stories. It was born to count sheep. It was born to track who delivered how many units of barley to the temple storehouse. The earliest tablets are accounting documents, lists, quantities, symbols for goods and for numbers, depressed by bureaucrats into clay that was then dried in the sun. Practicality, not poetry, was the mother of the written word. But once the technology existed, once humans had a system for encoding information outside the human brain, everything that came after became possible. law, history, literature, science. Every book ever written descends in a direct and literal line from a clay tablet in Uruk that says 37 sheep received, 29 distributed, 8 remaining. Think about that for a moment. The distance between that tablet and the words you are hearing right now is vast in time, but it is a single continuous thread. But cities are not only systems, cities are people. And in Uruk, the people were navigating something that no human beings had ever had to navigate before. How to live in close proximity with strangers. This sounds simple, it is not. For the overwhelming majority of human prehistory, a person's social world was composed entirely of people they knew personally. Relatives, neighbors, members of the same clan, trading partners they had met at a seasonal gathering. Trust was personal. Obligation was personal. The mechanisms for resolving conflict were personal. You knew who owed you what. You knew whose word to trust. You knew the history of every person you interacted with. Uruk shattered all of that. In a city of 30 or 50 or 80,000 people, you cannot know everyone. You cannot have a personal relationship with your grain supplier, your sandal maker, your canal neighbor, and the priest who administers the ration you depend on for survival. You interact constantly with strangers, and strangers, in the evolutionary logic of the human animal, are dangerous. They are unpredictable. They cannot be trusted by default. So Uruk invented something to bridge that gap. Not trust exactly, but its institutional substitute, the contract, the official record. The seal impressed into clay that meant, this transaction happened, this quantity was agreed upon, this person is accountable. The cylinder seal, a small engraved stone cylinder that could be rolled across wet clay to leave a distinctive mark like a personal signature, became one of the most important technologies of the ancient world. It was a way of saying, I was here. I agreed to this. My identity is attached to this obligation. This was not comfortable. The records we have from Uruk and the cities that followed it tell us that life for most people was hard. The laborers who worked the canals and the fields received rations. Grain, oil, beer, rather than wages. The distinction matters. A ration is not payment for a service freely rendered. It is sustenance given to a body that belongs, in some meaningful sense, to the institution that feeds it. Slavery and near-slavery were foundational to the Uruk economy, as they would be foundational to almost every large economy that followed for the next 4,000 years. The grandeur of the White Temple was built on the backs of men and women who had no meaningful choice about the work they were doing. And yet people came. From the countryside, from smaller settlements, from distant regions. They came because Uruk offered something the countryside could not. Density. Opportunity. Specialization. A person with a particular skill, metalworking, medicine, music, mathematics, could find in Uruk a large enough population to make that skill into a livelihood. A farmer in a village of 100 people had to be a farmer. In a city of 50,000, you could be something else. You could be, for the first time in human history, a specialist. There is a character in all of this who deserves a moment of attention. We do not know his name, or her name. The historical record does not preserve individual identities from this period with that kind of resolution. But we can reconstruct a type. An administrator. A mid-level official of the temple, responsible for a specific district of the city. A granary, a workshop complex, a section of the canal network. Imagine waking before sunrise in a room that is dark except for the orange glow of a small oil lamp. The room is made of mud brick, like everything else in the city. It is warm in winter, cool in summer, and it smells permanently of the clay from which it was made. And on the low table beside you is a stack of clay tablets from yesterday. Records that need to be checked against the actual inventory of the storehouse before the distribution begins. You get up, you dress, you eat a bowl of barley porridge with a little oil poured on top, which is what you eat every morning and what most people in Uruk eat every morning. You walk out into the alley, which is already busy. A woman carrying a large ceramic jar on her head, a boy driving 2 goats, A man sleeping against the wall who you recognize as someone who lost his canal allocation in the last redistribution cycle and has not recovered. You have power in this city. Not enormous power. You are not the chief priest, not the Lugal, the leader, the strong man who will eventually be remembered as something resembling a king. But you have the power of the record. You know what the storehouse holds. You know who is supposed to receive what. And in the gap between what the record says and what actually happens, there is room for the oldest form of bureaucratic corruption, the small adjustment. The rounding in one direction, the tablet that records 30 units received when 32 were actually delivered. We know this happened because the records themselves, when read carefully, show the anomalies. Uruk's administrative system was remarkably sophisticated, but it was also remarkably human. Which is to say, it was full of people trying to survive, trying to accumulate small advantages, trying to feed their families a little better than the ration allowed, trying to build the kind of microsecurity that a city without a safety net demanded. And this is the thing that Uruk teaches us, if we are willing to look at it honestly. The city did not create better people. It created more people doing more things, in more complicated relationships with each other. The ambition, the ingenuity, the generosity, and the exploitation, the corruption, the violence, all of it scaled up together. The city was not a solution to the problems of human nature. It was an amplifier. For nearly 1,000 years, from roughly 3,500 to 3,100 BCE, and a period historians call the Uruk expansion, the influence of this single city radiated outward across a vast geography. Uruk-style pottery, cylinder seals, administrative tablets, and architectural techniques appear at sites hundreds of kilometers from the city itself. Northward through Mesopotamia into what is now Syria and Turkey, eastward toward Iran, westward toward the Levant. Whether this represents colonization, trade, cultural diffusion, or some complex mixture of all three is still debated. But the reach is undeniable. Uruk was not just a city, it was a model, a template for how complexity could be organized. And other places were adopting that template, or having it imposed on them, faster than any previous idea had ever spread. This was the first globalization. Incomplete, slow by our standards, operating at the pace of ox carts and riverboats. But it was real. The world in 3200 BCE was more connected and more shaped by a single center of gravity than it had been at any previous point in human history. And then, gradually, it began to unravel. The Uruk expansion ended. The colonies were abandoned. The outposts stopped receiving goods from the south. The distinctive Uruk-style pottery disappears from the archaeological record at site after site across the northern and eastern reaches of the trade network, replaced by local traditions, as if the current that had been flowing outward from the city simply stopped. We do not know exactly why. The honest answer, the one that the evidence supports, is that it was not one thing. It was never one thing. Climate is part of the story. The southern Mesopotamian floodplain, for all its agricultural richness, is also one of the most environmentally fragile landscapes on Earth. The irrigation system that made Uruk possible also made it vulnerable. When you divert river water onto fields and allow it to evaporate in a hot, dry climate, you leave salt behind. Salt that accumulates in the soil. Salt that, over decades and centuries, makes the ground progressively less fertile. Ancient agricultural records from southern Mesopotamia show a slow shift over time in the proportions of crops grown. Less wheat, more barley, because barley tolerates salinity better. And then, eventually, less of everything. The land that had fed the city was being slowly poisoned by the very system that had made the city possible. The rivers themselves were unpredictable. A major shift in the course of the Euphrates, and the river did shift its course multiple times over the long span of Mesopotamian history, could cut a settlement off from its water supply almost overnight. The infrastructure of canals and levees that the city depended on required constant maintenance, constant labor, constant coordination. When the administrative system weakened, or when a drought reduced the labor surplus available for maintenance work, the canals silted up. The water stopped flowing, the fields dried, and there were political pressures too. The Uruk model of centralized redistribution through the temple was not the only possible model for organizing a city. As population grew and power became more complex, different factions competed for control. The Lugal, the military leader, the strong man, began to accumulate authority that rivaled the temple. The emergence of kingship, which becomes explicit in the written record by around 2900 BCE, marks a fundamental shift in how power was legitimated and exercised. Not through the priestly management of divine surplus, but through personal authority backed by force. Meanwhile, the periphery was learning. Either settlements that had been outposts of the Uruk network, or that had adopted Uruk-style administration under influence from the center, were developing their own institutional complexity. They no longer needed Uruk. They could organize themselves. The advantage that the original city had held, that it alone knew how to manage this kind of complexity, eroded as the knowledge spread. The empire of influence, such as it was, became redundant. And so Uruk changed. Not disappeared, not yet, not for a long time. The city persisted for another 3,000 years after the Uruk expansion ended, through the early dynastic period, through the Akkadian Empire, through the rule of the third dynasty of Ur, through conquest and reconstruction and slow, long decline. It was still inhabited, and in a much reduced form, into the Parthian period, which is to say into the early centuries of the Common Era, nearly 4,000 years after its first flowering. That is a span of time so vast that it makes the entire recorded history of Europe, from Rome to the present day, look brief. But the Uruk of the expansion period, the Uruk that was the largest and most complex human settlement on Earth, the Uruk that invented writing and the cylinder seal and large-scale irrigation and the redistributive economy, that Uruk was already fading by 3000 BCE. And by the time the great civilizations of Sumer reached their classical peak in the centuries, around 2500 BCE, Uruk had been surpassed by other cities: Ur, Nippur, Lagash, Amyaridu. The world that Uruk had created had moved on, and left its creator behind. The last inhabitants are thought to have abandoned the site sometime around 700 CE, the early Islamic period. By then, the rivers had shifted far enough away that the canals could no longer be maintained. The land was salt-damaged and dry. The temples had crumbled. The mud brick walls had melted back into the earth from which they came. Because mud brick, when abandoned, does not leave ruins in the stone castle sense. It dissolves. It becomes slowly, indistinguishably, the same flat mound of earth it was before anyone started building. German archaeologists began excavating the site of Uruk, known locally as Warka, in 1912. Now, they have continued with interruptions for 2 world wars and the wars in Iraq for over a century. What they found, and what they continue to find, is not the dramatic gold and stone monuments of Egypt or Greece. Mud brick does not preserve like limestone. What survives is subtler. The shapes of buildings visible only in the change of soil color. Tens of thousands of clay tablets, many still undeciphered. The ceramic record, millions of potsherds, the indestructible trace of every meal ever eaten, every liquid ever stored, every object ever made in clay. And in that humbler material, on a picture of daily life more intimate and more complex than most people expect when they hear the word ancient. The tablets tell us prices and rations, but they also tell us names, not famous names. The names of administrators and workers and farmers, the names of people who delivered fish and received grain and argued about canal allocations. They tell us that an administrator named Kushim, possibly the oldest named individual in the history of writing, signed off on a barley transaction sometime around 3200 BCE. Kushim, a name, a person, someone who woke up in Uruk, pressed a stylus into clay, and left a trace that would last 5,000 years. The excavations also revealed something that archaeologists spent decades arguing about: evidence of significant inequality. The houses near the temple precinct were larger and better built than those on the periphery. The grave goods found in burials varied enormously. Some individuals buried with ceramic vessels and personal ornaments, others with almost nothing. The ration lists showed different categories of workers receiving different quantities of food, with significant gaps between the top and the bottom of the distribution. Uruk was not a society of equals. It never had been. The very mechanisms that made it function, centralized redistribution, specialized labor, administrative hierarchy, were also mechanisms of stratification, and the city created for the first time the specific modern configuration of wealth and poverty that still defines urban life everywhere on Earth. There is a particular moment in the archaeological record of Uruk that stays with me. In the ruins of the Iana precinct, archaeologists found, buried beneath layers of later construction, a deposit of votive objects, small figurines, cylinder seals, miniature vessels, that had been deliberately placed there at some point during the late Uruk period. Objects offered to Inanna, objects that represent, in their accumulation, yet the prayers and anxieties and hopes of thousands of ordinary people who had brought something small and precious to leave at the foot of the goddess's house. And we do not know what they were praying for. We can guess. Rain, health, a better ration allocation, the safe return of a husband from a trading expedition, a child who had stopped eating. The specific petitions are lost, but the gesture, the impulse to carry something of value to a specific place and leave it there, in the hope that something larger than yourself is listening. That gesture is not lost. That gesture is as old as Uruk and as current as this morning. That is the thing about Uruk that I keep coming back to. Not the writing, not the irrigation, not the administrative system, though all of those matter enormously. And it is this: the people who lived there were not different from us in any meaningful way. They were running the same emotional software. They were managing the same fears. They were trying to make sense of the same gap between what they wanted and what the world was willing to give them. They built the first city not because they were trying to build civilization. They built it because they were trying to solve the problem of feeding people and moving water, and managing the endless friction of human beings living close together. They built it, in other words, for the same reasons we build everything. Because the problem was there and they were there, and they had to do something. And then, when the conditions changed, when the soil salted, when the rivers shifted, and when the political equation stopped balancing, they left. They went somewhere else. They adapted. The knowledge they had accumulated did not disappear with them. It moved. It transformed. It became the foundation for everything that came next. Sumer, Akkad, Babylon, Assyria, and the long chain of urban civilizations that eventually, through paths too tangled to trace in a single telling, led to the city or town or suburb in which you are listening to this right now. You are not separate from Uruk. You are downstream from it. The institution you work for, the economic system that prices the food you eat, the writing that carries the ideas you believe, all of it runs through Uruk, through that flat mound in the Iraqi desert, through the hands of people whose names we will never know, pressing reeds into clay in the light of oil lamps 5,000 years ago. The first city was not a paradise. It was not a utopia. It was, like every city that came after it, a place where an enormous number of people were trying to survive in proximity to each other, with all the ingenuity and all the cruelty that survival has always required. It rose because it solved a problem. It declined because the solution created new problems. It was abandoned eventually because the river moved away. And now it is a mound, a tell, a slight rise in the flat land of southern Iraq, barely noticeable from a distance, utterly unremarkable to anyone who does not know what it is. The first city in the world looks, from the outside, like nothing at all.